Thanks very much for joining us for episode 23 of InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my co-host for this edition, InTek President Shelley Austin. On this episode, we talk with the other half of an exciting opportunity for Mexico-U.S. freight and talk a lot about intermodal as well. Let's get started. On our last episode, we spoke with Richard Miller of Spearpoint about his company's New Border initiative and mentioned EASO as the Mexico-based partner. So who better to give EASO's perspective on this initiative and more than its Chief Commercial and Operating Officer, Diego Anchustegui, who also happens to be president of the Mexican Intermodal Association, known as AMTI. Diego, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
So tell us about EASO, your role with the company, and maybe you can pivot off into AMTI a little bit too.
Sure, perfect. So EASO doesn't sound as good in English, so it's ASO, and then we have a U.S. company, a U.S. subsidiary called Zigzag Logistics. And well, EASO, the whole group, it's a family-owned company. We have been in business for about 50 years, and we're one of the biggest logistics companies in Mexico. And recently we became the biggest IMC, Intermodal Marketing Company of Mexico. And well, it was started by my grandfather, who was a truck driver. We're always glad to talk about that. I'm very happy that we came from those origins, like most trucking companies. But EASO right now has four main revenue types. Our biggest revenue type is intermodal. Then we do a lot of dedicated business. Then we do some OTR, and then some truck brokerage. So it's a large company here in Mexico, but we are currently trying to expand it to North America and really focused on nearshoring and how we create the same footprint that we have done here in Mexico for the last 50 years and take it to the US. And well, regarding my second job, the job I don't get paid at, which is being the president of AMTI. So AMTI is an association that has been here in Mexico for about 25 years. It's an association that has around 55 partners from all around the logistics world, right? The supply chain. So we have the railroads. We have railroads like the UP, the Union Pacific, the BNSF. We have Ferromex. We have CPKCA as partners. We have a lot of trucking companies and drayage companies like Transportès Monterrey, EASO, some Mexican drayage companies. We have IMCs like Hub, JB Hunt, a lot of integrators. We have, of course, the intermodal ramps, the interior intermodal ramps here in Mexico, Hutchinson and Ferrovalle, and we have several of those. And we definitely have some steamship lines. So it's an important association. We always try, and our biggest objective is to grow intermodal in North America. So we are growing to do that.
Well, Diego, I am super excited, not only because Richard has said so many wonderful things about you, but, I feel like we have this connection that nobody really knows, because I fortunately have been able to be the chairman of IANA this year. So I feel like we have a similar role there. And yes, the job you don't get paid for, but you're very passionate about it. And so I would agree. I also know that you spoke at our expo in September. So thank you for that. And I think that's fantastic. I think the more that we can grow those two organizations together, IANA and AMTI, the better it's going to be for the whole intermodal space. And we can continue to find things there. I do think that I need to be on the speaker list because I hear that your meeting is in Cancun. Now, Long Beach is not so bad, but I really think Cancun sounds a whole lot better to me.
It does. Yeah. Sorry, Long Beach.
The only bad thing of having it in Cancun, that it's indoor meetings, so not everybody's happy about that. They want to go, they want to stay in the beach. But yeah, I completely agree with you. So I have been talking a lot with IANA on how we could really become an association of North America, right? So IANA, it's all of North America, and sometimes not complaining, but we have forgotten that North America, it's also Mexico and Canada. So yeah, I have had a lot of conversation, and IANA, it's wonderfully open about it, of how we can actually coordinate work between Mexico Intermodal and the US. And I think this is a perfect time. I think this is Mexico time. And right now we're seeing intermodal in Mexico at an infancy level compared to what has happened intermodal in the US. And we're seeing that growth due to nearshoring of intermodal in the next, I don't know, hopefully 3, 4, 5 years. We're going to see an exceptional growth from intermodal. And IANA is there for us to help, right? So IANA is helping us to see what we can do with the UIIA agreement, what we can do with the geofencing idea or project that you guys are handling right now. So I think there's a lot of collaboration between IANA and AMTI. And I'm so glad that I'm here as president right now, so I can start that collaboration and grow the partnership.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was just speaking with Joni about it, and I think that we can continue those efforts, and it really is one solution, right? It is, you mentioned, it's the North America solution. Let's put these resources together and really do something with it to cultivate and grow that, because I think that that's why we're doing these podcasts, because I think there's so many things out there that the shipper community really doesn't know that the tools are out there. And unless we start working together to show them, that's how we get more product on the intermodal system. That's how we get more cross-border shippers. That's really how we continue to grow that. So I'm super excited and really happy that you joined us, and looking forward to hearing more from you today.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And it's good that you mentioned, and I love that you mentioned the one solution, right? And we just had the conference in Cancun, and Lawrence Gross, that talks a lot in IANA, came with us, and Tony Hatch came with us to explain a little bit about what has happened in the US, what's happening right now, and how can we actually ramp up those numbers. And as you said, getting the shippers involved on that one solution. And right now, Mexico is going through a tough time in capacity. So we are short of around 50,000 drivers, wow, which is a little bit tough. And if you think 50,000 drivers in the US, it wouldn't be a big number because you have a lot more trucks in the system. 50,000 drivers in Mexico, it's a big number. Right. So each of the companies are operating at around 70-80% of the trucks, the trucks working versus the trucks stopped in their yards. So intermodal rises as the solution. And I always talk about this. Intermodal rises to the solution of nearshoring, and it rises to the solution of how we could actually get that volume that's going to come from nearshoring into the US. So completely agree. We have to work together on that one solution, and that one solution for nearshoring and for the lack of capacity in Mexico, it's definitely nearshoring.
Yeah, absolutely. And Diego, you mentioned one thing about a big challenge, which would be the driver shortage. Well, what else do you see are some, big challenges as the market continues to grow and we see all this, nearshoring, like you mentioned, but from what we're hearing, it's not here yet, right? So if there's a challenge now and, it's not here yet, it's built it, they will come, and they're definitely going to come. If there's a challenge now, what are some of the other challenges that we all have to focus on to make sure that when it does come, that everything is in a good place for operations?
That scares me a little bit. So you mentioned a perfect thing. The issues are now, that the issues are happening right now. So if we have capacity issues to move freight from Mexico to the US right now, what are we going to expect in the next year? So definitely you have a point there. On what are other risk factors, I would put number one, infrastructure. The infrastructure on the roads, on the highways, on getting to those ports and the port services in Mexico, the infrastructure is not there. So, for example, Manzanillo Port handles around 4 million TEUs a year, right? So if you compare that, that's our biggest port. If you compare that to LA, Long Beach, if you compare that to some of the ports in China, we are, again, on an infancy level on what we're moving through the ports. And while private money is there and infrastructure is going to grow on the private side and the ports are going to grow and Hutchinson and APM and all of those port services are going to invest in Mexico, I'm really worried about the infrastructure connecting those points, right? So actually the infrastructure from the ports to the consumers and from the ports to the factories and all of those, there has to be a change, right? So that's my number one issue right now. The number two issue is definitely capacity. I mentioned a little bit about that, but we have to get the capacity issue solved, and we have to work with the railroads, and we have to work with the drayage carriers, and we have to work with everybody to get that capacity running and growing. And the third one is definitely security. Security is still a big issue. You hear in the US all these headlines, which some are exaggerated, but there's security issues, of course, in Mexico. And the theft of freight, it's grown by 10% this year versus last one. So that 10% of growth in theft, that's very bad for Mexico. A lot of shippers don't like that. They see it as a big issue putting their shop here. So that definitely can hurt a little bit of nearshoring.
So Diego, I have a couple of questions, and I get you said so much there. Hopefully I remember exactly what I want to ask. So my first question is going to be when you talk about capacity, because for me, capacity runs in many different forms, right? So you have capacity for equipment, you have capacity for trucks, you have capacity for drivers. capacity in the intermodal space would include like chassis, right? So tell me, is it mostly on the driver side? What about equipment? I mean, so here in the US, everybody kind of drank the COVID Kool-Aid and bought so much equipment that we have plenty. So tell me about outside of the drivers as far as, trucks and what, like the different versions of trucks, right? There's all kinds of different things that people are doing with trucks, then equipment and chassis. Let's talk about some of those other things when you talk about that capacity.
We're guilty of drinking that Kool-Aid. We bought a lot of equipment during.
It doesn't sound very tasty. I don't know why everyone wants to drink that Kool-Aid.
I think nobody learns. And that's, you ship that on the shipping lines, companies buying more and more ships, and nobody learns from the
right.
mistakes.
That's true.
And I think we can spend a year about that. And my wife could join us talking about how I don't learn from my mistakes. That's another discussion. But yeah, definitely the capacity issue in Mexico is more on the trucking side, more on drivers. We don't have drivers. We don't have trucks. A lot of the trucks that were manufactured during COVID were sent to the US because there was a truck issue. So we didn't have trucks in Mexico. We couldn't buy a truck in Mexico for 3-4 years. So imagine that being like a gap of not having truck sales in 3 years. And now everybody wants to start buying trucks. That was a big issue. And then you had the Chinese manufacturing trucks and all of that coming to Mexico because you couldn't get a truck. Right now in Mexico, it's still hard to buy a truck. So that has definitely made some dents in the trucking industry, also with the drivers. Mexico has an issue, and we talked this in Ayana. Mexico has an issue because when things get tight in the US about volume, all the trucking or all the intermodal companies in the US keep their trailers or their containers in the US. And now that everybody has capacity, they start sending them to Mexico. So we are starting to see a lot of that capacity come in from intermodal 53-foot containers for Mexico, US, and we see that capacity grow because the US market's so down right now. But we know when the market's going to pick up, there's not going to be any capacity here in Mexico. So the capacity fluctuates on intermodal depending on how hard it's the volume in the US and how soft it is. But I do see an issue on the trucking side. And this all comes to the percentage of intermodal moves versus OTR in Mexico. So the percentage of cross-border moves between Mexico and the US on intermodal, it's less than 5%.
Wow.
And those are all intermodal worthy lanes because if you think of Mexico and the US, a lot of lanes are over 600 miles. So that percentage is the percentage that we have to fight for. And that percentage is the percentage that is going to bring the growth to intermodal market in Mexico. So right now, even though there's capacity on containers, not a lot of shippers know about intermodal. There's not a lot of knowledge on intermodal and how the lanes can help you and how they would benefit on cost, on security, and all of the benefits from intermodal. So we don't see that capacity being strained right now on containers, but we do that with trucks and trailers. You cannot find really good capacity right now in Mexico for truck and trailers. You mentioned chassis and containers. Chassis, there was a big issue on COVID, the same as the US. We did not have chassis. Fortunately, the railroads here in Mexico and some railroads in the US invested in chassis in Mexico. So we're seeing a lot of improvement there. And we expect that to be enough for the next years. But I think from that one, we did learn from our mistakes and always that a container needs chassis. Yeah. Nobody thinks of that. But yeah, we're also going to think about that.
Excellent. And then my second one, see, I did okay, Diego. I only had two, so I could keep it right there in my head.
Oh, we have to get through it first.
But that's right. Yeah, that's right.
You're bragging before you ask the question.
Oh, okay, Kevin. Okay, gotcha. Well, I do that. No, so my second one, and you mentioned 5%, which is just still has me floored. I didn't know that percentage, so that is unbelievable. We need to increase that. You and I, we're going to work on that, okay?
Yeah.
But with that 5%, you also mentioned that because of the theft, that shippers have a little bit of hesitation of this great build in Mexico. But my question to you is, those two numbers should impact each other, those two factors should impact each other, right? Because the intermodal should be a safer mode of transit than trucking when it comes to the theft. Am I correct in that?
You're totally correct. So in the US, when you talk about benefits of intermodal, you talk about lower cost, more capacity, and it's a cleaner way of transport, right? But when you talk about intermodal in Mexico and cross-border, you have to put that security and safety from the freight on the fourth benefit. And you're totally right. So the two railroads in Mexico, the two big railroads, CPKC and Ferromex, have done a magnificent job in security. So right now, theft or incident level, it's around 0.05% of all the loads moved.
Wow.
And that in Mexico, it's extraordinary. And we have lanes that we haven't had a single theft issue in over a year, or in 2 years, or in 3 years. So they have done a magnificent job, and they have this philosophy or their way of thinking of not stopping the train and not having anybody get to the train so they can do some theft there. And they have done a magnificent job. So yeah, definitely a safer mode of transportation. On the last question, I kept on thinking on the last question, and I said that capacity in the US keeps on the US while capacity is tight. We're seeing in Mexico and AMTI, we're seeing this growth of intermodal IMCs like EASO, which was a trucking company and then became an IMC. And this is bringing capacity that's always going to stay in Mexico and the US. So we are focused on only keeping that cross-border movement. So even if the US volume gets tough, we're always going to be focused on keeping US to Mexico cross-border movements. So the shippers have a calm state of mind that we're always going to be there to move the containers back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
Definitely. We are in Mexico. Nobody really talks about this in the US, but there's a push of Mexican IMCs, and there's a push for Mexico intermodal intra-Mexico moves that's growing the intermodal market. No, there's not only the cross-border, but intermodal in Mexico is growing from the ports to inland Mexico, and it's also growing its intra-Mexico market.
Excellent.
So how is the infrastructure, the rail infrastructure for that? I know you mentioned infrastructure being like a concern from the ports and moving forward. How is the rail infrastructure looking in particular, and is that something that's improving?
It's definitely improving. So the rail infrastructure, it's not owned by the railroads here in Mexico. It's operated by them, but it's still the government, but they do have to put some money in it, and they have to invest on keeping the rail system going. And they have done a very good job also. The rails have really done an exceptional job on keeping the rail moving. And we have had the same rail system 100 years ago. But then this new president has started to building some more rail system. He started building the Southern Rail, which is called Tren Maya, which is going to connect from Coatzacoalcos, Villahermosa, which is like the southern part of Mexico. And he's going to connect all the southeast with a rail system. And he's also very big on the Interoceanico, which is going to connect by rail the Pacific coast with the Gulf Coast. He thinks it will compete with the Panama Canal. I don't think that putting a railroad there will compete, but at least he's investing in some rail. And whenever there's an investment in rail infrastructure, we're very happy about it. And we think that rail is the solution to capacity issues. So we agree that he should invest a lot more in rail, but we don't know if the project Interoceanico is going to work.
Speaking of the trucking situation in terms of the drivers, there have been a couple of things that came up. You mentioned the security, and that's sort of been listed among a big level of priority in some of the labor issues that have been going on as well. So what do you see really in terms of the security issue being addressed as the next several months and coming years go?
Unfortunately, we're hearing that it's getting addressed, but we're not seeing it in the numbers. And that hurts us a lot on the driver issue, because nobody wants to be a driver. And there's a lot of drivers leaving their job just because they have that security issue. And before, the level of violence when there was a truck hijacking was not there. Right now, the level of violence on a hijacking, it's horrible. So you hear about drivers getting shot at, you hear about drivers missing from their houses 2 to 3 days. And that's just horrible. We're really trying to do something about it, but it's getting hard. Something that we're trying to improve on the private community and on the associations and everything, it's the technology we put in the trucks, right? So the camera facing forward, facing the driver, how we can monitor this one, each truck with GPS on the trailer, GPS on the container, and having more technology. But this is going to impact what's happening this year, is going to impact the next 3, 5, 10 years of drivers, because they're getting scared. They're leaving the trucks, and we're not seeing those drivers. And a lot of drivers are going to the US because of the B1 visa. And certainly when they come to us as a trucking company and they tell us, hey, I'm getting a job that I might get paid $90,000, $100,000 per year, and I'm not going to have security issues in the US and everything, we say, just leave and we're happy for you. So if these issues don't get solved, there's going to be an issue. But as you guys mentioned, intermodal rises again as the best mode of transportation because of safety also, right? So we're going to see that on the drayage side. But when it enters a terminal, then you start getting safer.
So, Diego, one of the other things that we find as a challenge on the trucking side for cross-border transit is the customs clearance. And so a question that I have for you, is that just something that we find, or is it true that there can be some benefits also in the intermodal space when it comes to customs clearance versus on the trucking side?
Definitely. That's also a big benefit on the cross-border move. So custom clearance, when you go to a truck, you mostly have a Mexican truck. They get to Laredo, then they have a truck that crosses the border, and the truck lines are huge right now in Laredo. Everybody has heard about the government in Texas holding up the trucks and doing more inspections. And then you have a US truck that has to send it to the final destination. While you're using intermodal, the containers travel in bond, which is a huge, huge benefit. So we're clearing customs at the terminal ramp at origin. So for example, we can clear customs at Cerro Valle or Puerta Mexico ramp. So you clear customs in Mexico, and then the train goes in bond into the US, so it doesn't stop at the border. And that adds a lot of security, drugs and other things that could get passed in the border. That adds a ton of security going in bond, and it saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of issues at the border, and it has some benefits. On the other side, on the southbound, we have been traveling a lot. We have been working a lot with the US, with the Mexican customs, because they're having some issues. For example, the Senacica, which the Mexican customs says that they have to inspect everything that is from animal-based at the border, at the crossing point. So we're working to expand that and either inspected at origin in the US at certain locations or inspected at destination at the destination ramp. Those are some things that we have been trying to work with the association on how to get those free clearances so they don't have to stop at the border. If you think about intermodal customs, you have to think about it as being borderless. When you travel intermodal, it literally takes away the border and it connects both countries. So having that in bond makes it definitely much better.
Again, 5%. It's all sounding wonderful to me. This 5% thing, I'm not getting it yet, but we'll figure that out.
Nobody gets it. And we have been working a lot on how to work through that. And I think it's a lot with the culture that everybody thinks that Laredo is Mexico and Mexico ends and starts in Laredo and nothing happens through that. So we have been working a lot with the associations and with shippers on getting them to understand what the Mexican intermodal roadmap is, how it works, and the benefits. But I think those 5% are going to grow hard.
I agree with you. I agree. Starting after this podcast today.
we have to do something. And
we do.
Really, it's not only about being cheaper and being safer and being all these big benefits, but it's the way to go. It's the only way that shippers are going to have or BCOs are going to have if they really want to start moving their product and their freight.
Agreed.
And speaking of that product and freight, is it pretty wide open in terms of the type of freight that people can move? I mean, all sorts of different commodities, things like that. Is there anything that really doesn't work for this?
So everything works. We haven't done a very good job on getting refrigerated containers and using refrigerator boxes coming back and forth. Something that doesn't work is the animal products that are coming from the US to Mexico. That thing we have to get fixed with Senacica. But the thing that mostly moves on intermodal right now, it's automotive, right? So automotive, it's the biggest thing that moves on intermodal cross-border, but we have to get that into FAK. So we're really trying to focus on the consumer goods, on electronics and all of that, getting those volumes up. I think that's our main focus right now. Automotive, they use it, they know about it, but how do you get that middle or smaller customer to really understand intermodal and grow with that?
We had a guest on our podcast a couple of months ago from CPKC, and she was actually talking about an increased focus on produce. And because of what you just said about the border crossing, the more certainty in terms of time, that it's actually faster in many cases to use intermodal to get from Mexico into their Chicago hub. So do you see that as an area of growth coming up soon too?
Definitely. So we were really happy to learn that CPKC just bought 2,000 or invested in 2,000 containers, refrigerated containers, to start moving products between Mexico and the US. So those are the type of things that we love to hear. That is great news. And that gives us opening with the government to start moving that type of product and really focus on growing produce. But I see a growth in everything, right? So for example, when we see the volume, right now we're moving around, Mexico is producing about 3 million cars. and Tesla 4 million cars a year, and Tesla is going to bring in 1.2 million more cars a year. So that growth is going to be moving everything, automotive, FAK, everything that can move on a box. We're definitely going to see a growth through that.
Awesome. So speaking of exciting new things, and we were so fortunate to meet you, Diego, through Richard, but tell us about the new border partnership. This is another thing that gets me all excited, and I love talking about these new solutions and all the different things that can happen with this. And I just think that it's on the cusp of something great. I'm really excited about it. So tell us a bit about that and what it means for both of, EASO and SpearPoint and how that's going to come together.
First, this is the only good news that you're gonna hear. This is the one. This is how cross-border shipments should be made. And it started with an idea about 4 years ago. We have always been focused in the company about how to move cross-border efficiently, and we have always done it through Laredo. We have done it through several ways, and we have always found that border crossing it's not what it should be. So it takes a lot of time. People think of the border, it's a hazard of security. A lot of people don't understand it. So it took us about 4 years of understanding where are the moves, where there's a lot less capacity, where are the consumers in the US, where everything is getting produced in Mexico. And then we started thinking about how to move it more efficiently. And how do you move it more efficiently? Having an overweight service, right? So we did this overweight service on Intermodal that has Richard's or SpearPoint warehouse where we connect both Mexico and the US. And you can have around 25% more actual payload on the trailer. So that's very beneficial. And another great part is that we decided to do in Dallas because Dallas, it's a consumer market. Not a lot of that there's not a lot of production there. So you have a lot of capacity there, a lot of capacity that can be used to move that capacity into the US instead of using Laredo. So we think of bypassing Laredo as the best solution for cross-border because Laredo, you don't have space there. Trucking is very expensive there. You don't have a lot of players working on the trucking. You don't have good intermodal solutions that can really connect you to the whole US. And we see Dallas as a main hub. So we see that as taking a non-capacity market, like in Mexico, because a lot of trucks have to come empty, and putting that freight in Dallas.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I know when we talked to Richard, I mean, the overweight piece is phenomenal and it has such a great application. The other piece that I think is really big is less than truckload shipping, because I think that's it's I don't know if I'll call it complicated or frustrating in the U.S., less than truckload, but it is complicated, in my opinion, when you're looking at into and out of Mexico for less than truckload. And I think this gives such a great opportunity to bring those types of shipments into the U.S., as you mentioned, kind of break it and distribute it out in a much more efficient manner.
Definitely. LTL is a big issue between Mexico and the US, and that's definitely going to help LTL, but it's going to help also on capacity, right? So the main focus was price, but also capacity and getting that capacity with a flow of containers just going back and forth from the warehouse to the loading. That definitely going to work. We're very excited to have Richard as a partner. He's a great guy, a lot of experience in Mexico and a lot of experience on railroad.
So backing up a little bit to the inclusion of intermodal in your operation, I know you mentioned, this is a family business that goes back around 50 years or so. So were you kind of behind getting intermodal into the company, and what led you to do that?
Yeah, so we have always been a trucking company, and as a trucking company, I still believe that some trucking companies see intermodal as their enemy, right? And we started looking at the lanes that we were covering. For example, in Mexico, we were covering Mexico City from Tijuana, which is around 2,500 miles. And we did that all by truck. So then we started talking with Ferromex and saying, what can we do together to do this more efficiently? And then we started that intermodal service that's called Interpacifico, and starting to ship everything that we were moving by truck into intermodal. So all of our customers that we already had on truck started gradually changing it to intermodal. And right now I can say we're moving around 2,000 shipments a month on those lanes. And we're not doing one truck service on those lanes. So everything switched. And it was hard because intermodal in Mexico is not very known. But intermodal was definitely the solution so we could start moving it more efficiently. And at the beginning, customers didn't understand, why am I going to have a longer transit time? But then they started changing all their logistics platforms and having more DCs where the railroads were, and everything has changed. It only took us 8 years for intermodal to be our biggest revenue type. And that's just impressive. It was the smartest decision. My dad is the one that took the decision, not me, but it was definitely the smartest decision we could have taken. And it has improved the company. It has improved on the volume that we're handling, and it has huge benefits here in Mexico. Right now, what we're seeing the growth focused on, it's intra-Mexico, keep on growing it, but how to grow that 5% on cross-border, but also the percentage moved on the 40s and 20s, the international moves, is very low. So the Puerto Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas moves intermodal less than 30% or even less than 20% moves on intermodal, and there's still capacity issues. So how can we ramp those numbers up and get those 40s and 20s containers moving more on train?
One other thing I wanted to hit on before we wrap this up, you also have ties to the University of Denver and the Transportation and Supply Chain Institute. So tell us about your involvement in that and where you see the importance of, we mentioned driver shortages, obviously, but people in general in the logistics industry. It's something that you always want to cultivate new talent.
So I was in cohort 16, and it all started with me looking at a very good program that included intermodal, included the whole supply chain, and how would I grow on learning about the U.S. business and could bring it to Mexico. And I had a great time there. I learned a lot. I had some of the best professors in my whole time teach me about economics, on trucking, economics, on intermodal, how the big companies do things, and then I could implement those here in Mexico. So it was a great program. And then I was invited to be part of the board. So right now I'm part of the board, and I'm very happy to do so. I really believe that it's the premier program to understand transportation and supply chain in the US. You take care of all things. You understand even how buses work, how trains work, how trucking companies work, how IMCs work. And it really explains transportation, right? So I have been in other programs here in Mexico, which they talk more about warehousing and where to put the warehousings. But that wasn't applicable for me. I'm in transportation. I want to know how to move things, how to make it more efficiently. Where are the ports? What do they move and everything? And you can definitely learn it in the system. And I think the finance part of Denver University of DTI, it's the best finance part for transportation you can find out there.
Great. So we talked about a lot of stuff. Tell us where people can find more about, your company, AMTI, anything else you wanted to mention.
So the company, of course, EASO.com, and we're in Facebook, we're in Instagram, we're in everything. And please contact us if you need something going on from Mexico to the U.S. We really believe we're the partner, or your U.S.-Mexico partner. We really believe that we can help you find the best way to move your freight. We definitely believe that the warehouse in Dallas is going to be the most efficient way to move the freight. And regarding AMTI, we had a wonderful meeting in Cancun. We had a lot of U.S. people come to the conference this year, and it really gave it a big push, right? We need you guys in the U.S. to come to Mexico and learn how rail and intermodal is working in Mexico and how we can improve it. The U.S. is being really good at doing intermodal. We need that in Mexico. We need your expertise and really want to focus on how to do a good solution between Mexico and the U.S. So please look us up and please try to come to AMTI and figure how we do things. And we would be happy to have you here.
Great, Diego. Thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Diego.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us for InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. And thanks very much to Diego Anchustegui for taking the time to speak with us. Check out the links in the description to learn more about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And you can help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. If you have questions, email us at podcast@intechlogistics.com and visit intechfreight-logistics.com for more about what we do. For Shelley Austin, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll talk to you next time.